This is the most powerful man in Catholic history, dragged from his seat, beaten, slapped and shamed by soldiers. Not in the name of God, but in the name of a king. It sounds like a scene from a medieval movie, right? But it really happened. And it forever changed the Catholic Church. In the year 1303, a French king attacked the Pope himself. What came next was a fierce battle between throne and altar, between worldly power and spiritual power. One single night of violence destroyed the idea that the Pope was untouchable and started 100 years of chaos. This script was created through careful research. No AI was used. Tell us in the comments what story you'd like us to cover next and where you're watching from. This is the story of how King Philip IV of France kidnapped Pope Boniface VIII and in doing so stole the papacy itself. But how did a king dare to lay hands on the Pope? That's where our story begins. It's 1294. Rome's air is thick with ambition, incense, and quiet whispers. Inside the dark halls of the Vatican, a new pope takes the throne of Saint Peter. His eyes burn with a vision that could reshape the world or tear it apart. His name is Benedetto Caetani, but history called him Pope Boniface VIII. He was born around 1235 in the rugged hills of Anagni. Boniface knows power well. He is a brilliant church lawyer and has spent decades climbing the ranks of the church. His ambition is matched only by his belief that the church should rule above all. When he puts on the papal crown, it is not just a ceremony, it is a statement. I am Caesar, I am emperor, he is said to have declared, his voice echoing through the marble corridors. To Boniface, the papacy is not only a spiritual office, it is God's authority on earth, able to bend kings and nations to its will. But Boniface's rise is wrapped in controversy. His predecessor, Celestine V, a gentle old hermit, shocked the world by giving up the papacy after only a few months, something no pope had done before. Whispers spread that Boniface, then a cardinal, pushed Pope Celestine V to resign, using clever words to convince the old man he was unfit for the throne. Some even mutter about darker actions, of threats hidden behind polite promises. Celestine is now locked away in a distant castle, a living reminder of Boniface's ruthless climb. Yet Boniface feels no guilt. His dream is too big for remorse. A world where the papacy reigns supreme, where kings kneel before Christ's vicar, and where the church's power, spiritual and earthly, knows no limits. Across the Alps, in the rich courts of Paris, another man also dreams of power. King Philip IV of France, called Philip the Fair, is a monarch whose striking looks match his ambition. At 29, his piercing blue eyes and golden hair make him seem like a king from legend, but his heart is hard as iron. Ruling since 1285, Philip believes in the divine right of kings, the idea that God himself chose him to rule. France was growing strong, its treasury swells with trade and conquest. But Philip's hunger for glory grows faster than his wealth. Wars rage on his borders, especially against England, where Edward I's armies threaten French power. To fund his campaigns, Philip looks at a tempting prize: the great wealth of the French clergy, whose lands and tithes glitter like gold. The stage is set for a clash of giants. On one side, Boniface VIII, a pope who sees himself as the sun shining on the world, with kings as moons reflecting his light. On the other, Philip IV, a king who bows to no one, least of all a pope in distant Rome. Their fight is not only personal, it is a struggle for the soul of medieval Europe, where church and state overlap and power is worth any cost. It all began in 1296. Philip imposes a bold new tax on the French clergy, breaking centuries of tradition that protected the church from such demands. The clergy, loyal to Rome, cry out in protest, their pleas reaching Boniface's ears. The Pope answers swiftly and firmly. From the Vatican, he issues the papal bull Clericis Laicos, a thunderbolt that shakes Europe's courts. This decree states that no lay ruler may tax the clergy without papal consent. Anyone who disobeys risks excommunication, a spiritual death sentence that could ruin a king's soul and his rule. Boniface's message is clear. The church is sovereign, its wealth untouchable, its authority from God. To Philip, the bull is not only a challenge but an insult, a glove thrown at his feet. In France, some of his advisors warn caution, pointing to the church's huge influence over the faithful. But Philip is no ordinary king. He sees Boniface's action as an overreach and a chance to prove his own supremacy. The French clergy are caught in the middle, torn between their king and their pope. Some pay Philip's tax, others resist, their loyalties split. In Rome, Boniface grows angry as his advisors whisper of Philip's defiance, of a king bold enough to challenge the vicar of Christ. It is 1296. In Paris, the air feels charged with anger. Inside the Grand Palais de la Cité, King Philip IV paces like a caged lion, his blue eyes flashing. At his feet lies Pope Boniface VIII's bull, Clericis Laicos, a papal order forbidding kings to tax clergy without permission from Rome, under pain of excommunication. To Philip, it is not just an insult, it is an open war. A king who bows to no one will not kneel now, not to Rome, not to Boniface, not to anyone. Philip strikes back quickly and cleverly. He bans the export of gold and silver from France. It is a dagger aimed straight at the papacy's heart because the church depends on the flow of French money to fill its coffers. Without it, Boniface's dream of papal supremacy begins to weaken. French clergy whisper in their monasteries, torn between their king's order and their pope's command. In Rome, Boniface rages as news of the embargo reaches him. The pope who once called himself emperor now finds his power tested by a king bold enough to choke the church's lifeblood. By 1297, the strain is unbearable. Boniface, always practical under his grand image, senses the tide turning. With France's money cut off and other rulers murmuring against him, he bends. In a reluctant new bull, he allows kings to tax clergy in times of necessity, without papal approval. It is a bitter pill, a temporary truce that tastes like defeat. Philip, victorious, lifts his embargo. His message is clear. The King of France will not be cowed, but both men know the peace will not last. It is only a pause before the storm. It began in 1301 in the rough diocese of Pamiers. There, a new spark flares. Bishop Bernard Seist, fiercely loyal to Rome, has long been a thorn in Philip's side. His sermons full of criticism of the king's power. Philip seizes his chance. He orders Seist arrested on charges of treason, accusing the bishop of plotting against the crown. The arrest is bold, a direct blow to Boniface's claim that clergy answer only to the Pope. In Paris, Philip's advisors smile in the shadows. In Pamiers, the faithful gasp as their bishop is dragged in chains before royal judges, a living sign of the king's audacity. In Rome, Boniface's fury erupts. The arrest of a bishop, his bishop by a secular ruler, strikes at the core of papal authority. From the Vatican's gilded rooms, he writes a new bull, Ausculta Filii. Listen, son, addressing Philip like a wayward child. He demands Seise's release and restates the Pope's power over all Christian rulers, both spiritual and earthly. God has set us over kings and kingdoms, Boniface writes, sure of his divine authority. Couriers ride through the night carrying the bull to France, unaware they hold a spark that could set Europe ablaze. Philip's reply was fury, not obedience. In a public square in Paris, before nobles, clergy and commoners, the king orders Ausculta Fili burned. Its parchment curls to ash as flames roar. The act is sacrilege, a direct insult to Rome. But Philip is not finished. With cunning, he circulates a forged version of the bull, twisting Boniface's words to make the Pope seem a tyrant bent on enslaving France. The streets buzz with outrage as Philip's propaganda spreads, turning public opinion against the arrogant Pope. For the first time, Philip calls assemblies early Estates General, where nobles, clergy, and townsfolk unite against Rome. The king, once distant, now appears as a defender of French pride, his defiance a rallying cry against foreign interference. The year 1301 ends with the battle lines sharper than ever. Boniface, in his Roman palace, broods over Philip's insults. His dream of papal supremacy is threatened by a king who burns his decrees and mocks his power. Philip, in Paris, stands emboldened. His arrest of Seiset and destruction of Ausculta Fili clear signs of his intent to bend the church to his will. But the clash has only begun. What happens next will bring the Pope face to face with the king's fury and end with a night that shocks the world. It was summer of 1302. Rome hums like a city under siege, not by soldiers, but by ideas. In the rich rooms of the Vatican, Pope Boniface VIII, now in his late 60s, sits on his throne, eyes burning with the fire of a man convinced he holds the keys to heaven and earth. The air smells of incense and ambition, but beneath the jeweled tiara, Boniface seethes. King Philip IV of France, the golden-haired monarch who dared to burn his bull, Ausculta Fili, still defies him. The defiance from Paris gnaws at Boniface's soul, striking at his dream of a world where the papacy rules above all. With his sinews tight with resolve, he prepares his boldest move yet. The bull Unam Sanctam, a thunderclap of papal authority meant to echo through Christendom. Issued in November 1302, Unam Sanctam is more than a decree. It is a manifesto of divine supremacy. It is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff, Boniface proclaims, his words written in ink and fire. The bull declares the Pope's spiritual and earthly power above all kings, a direct challenge to rulers like Philip, whose divine right monarchy bows to no one. Boniface's message is clear. To defy the Pope is to defy God himself. It is a gauntlet thrown at Philip's feet, daring him to submit or face eternal judgment. In the torchlit Vatican halls, his advisors whisper nervously. They know this bull will ignite a firestorm, but Boniface, resolute, believes his power cannot be shaken. He is Caesar, he is emperor. Across the Alps, in busy Paris, King Philip IV receives the bull with a sneer. At 34, his looks are still striking, but his heart is a furnace of ambition and defiance. The Palais de la Cité buzzes with the energy of a king who thrives on challenge. Philip will not kneel, not to Boniface, not to Rome, not to anyone. In April 1302, he calls the Estates General, summoning nobles, merchants, and clergy to his cause. The great hall echoes with the voices of France's elite, their loyalty to the crown heavier than their fear of Rome. The nobles, eager for a strong king, cheer Philip's defiance. Merchants and townsfolk see in him a protector of French pride. The clergy, torn between spiritual duty and fear of royal wrath, mostly fall in line. Philip stands before them, his golden hair catching the light, a living emblem of France's rising might. But Philip's sharpest weapon is not speeches. It is the cunning of his council, led by Guillaume de Nogaret, a ruthless lawyer loyal to the king. In June 1303, Nogaret launches a shocking assault, accusations that Boniface is a heretic, a blasphemer, a simoniac who bought the papal throne, even a murderer complicit in Celestine V's fate. They claim his election was illegitimate, using old rumors of Celestine's abdication. These charges mix truth, exaggeration, and outright lies, but truth does not matter in this war of words. Philip's agents thunder across France, spreading propaganda that paints Boniface as a devil in papal robes. Monasteries are pressured to denounce him. City councils are forced into public condemnations. Pamphlets and whispers flood the streets, turning public feeling into a weapon against Rome. Philip, the master manipulator, uses the voice of the people as a battering ram against the papacy. In Rome, Boniface feels the noose tightening. The accusations sting not because they are true, but because they fuel a growing wave of resistance. His dream of a universal church with kings as vassals begins to crumble under Philip's campaign. Enraged, Boniface prepares his ultimate weapon, a bull to excommunicate Philip and put France under interdict, a spiritual embargo stopping baptisms, marriages, and last rites across the kingdom. Such a move would plunge France into chaos, turning the faithful against their king. In the candlelit Vatican chambers, scribes scratch out the words that could topple a monarch. Boniface, his face lined but determined, knows this is his final stand. The bull, set for September 1303, will be his declaration of total war. The medieval world holds its breath. Philip's propaganda machine roars, making France a fortress of defiance. Boniface's Unam Sanctum echoes like a battle cry, its claim of papal supremacy a direct challenge to Philip's rule. The war of words has reached fever pitch, each side using decrees and accusations like swords. Nobles, clergy, and commoners must choose between heaven and crown. The stakes are as high as they can be: a king's throne, a pope's authority, and the soul of Christendom itself. But words will soon give way to action. Before long, steel will speak where ink once ruled, and the world will never forget what happens next. The sun rose over the hills of Anagni on September 7, 1303, bathing the town, the birthplace of Pope Boniface VIII. Inside the papal palace, the air was tense. Boniface, now nearly 70, sat in his grand chair, weary from his long struggle against King Philip IV of France. Before him lay an unfinished bull, ready to excommunicate the French king and cast his kingdom into spiritual darkness. It was meant to be Boniface's final stand for the supremacy of the papacy, but danger was already on its way. In Paris, King Philip had grown tired of words and propaganda. With cold determination, he sent Guillaume de Nogaret, his ruthless advisor, and Sciarra Colonna, a bitter enemy of Boniface, on a mission to Italy. The Colonna family, stripped of their lands and shamed by Boniface, saw this as their chance for revenge. Backed by hundreds of mercenaries, knights, and Colonna loyalists, they marched toward Anagni. Their goal was clear: capture the Pope, force him to abdicate, and destroy his dream of absolute papal power. But could even a fortified city like Anagni protect its most famous son? The betrayal came from within. A local ally, tempted by French gold and Colonna, promises secretly opened the gates of Anagni. Soldiers poured into the streets, torches in hand, as the townspeople hid in fear. On September 7, the invaders stormed the papal palace. Guards fell, doors were smashed, and Boniface's cardinal's men, who once swore loyalty, fled for their lives. The Pope stood alone. What would happen when the shepherd of Christendom faced the wolves himself? In the Great Hall, Boniface refused to run. Wearing his papal vestments, tiara shining on his head, he faced Nogaret and Sciarra Colonna. They demanded his abdication. Sciarra, fueled by years of hatred, stepped forward and struck the old pope across the face. The infamous Anagni slap. For the first time in history, a secular hand had dared to strike the Vicar of Christ. Blood on his lip, Boniface stood firm and declared, "I desire to die for Christ's faith and his church." His courage lit a spark, but could defiance alone save him? For 3 days, Boniface was held prisoner, while his enemies looted his treasures. Outside the palace, whispers spread of the Pope's humiliation. The townspeople's anger grew until, at last, they rose up. Farmers, craftsmen, and merchants armed themselves and stormed the palace. Nogaret and Colonna's army was caught off guard and fled, their power crumbling in the night. Boniface was freed, bruised but unbroken, his tiara still on his head. But was this victory enough to heal the wound left on the papacy's dignity? The slap at Anagni shocked the world. It was more than an insult, it was a blow against the authority of the church itself. The Colonnas' revenge, the betrayal of allies, and the desertion of cardinals exposed the weakness of the papacy. Yet Boniface's refusal to give in, even under threat of death, preserved his legacy as a pope who would rather perish than surrender. Still, as Boniface returned to Rome, he knew the dream of papal supremacy had been shattered. In France, Philip and Nogaret plotted their next move. The clash at Anagni was not the end, but the beginning of an even greater storm. As we and the world waited, holding its breath for the final reckoning. October 1303 dawned over Rome, heavy with shadows and whispers. The eternal city, once the shining heart of papal power, now felt hollow. Pope Boniface VIII, the man who once dared to call himself emperor, returned to the Vatican as a broken figure. The outrage at Anagni had scarred him, his body frail, his spirit shaken by betrayal and humiliation. Nearly 70, he moved through the marble halls like a ghost, the jeweled tiara weighing on his tired head. The words he once cried in defiance, "I desire to die for Christ's faith and his church," still burned in his heart. But the flame was fading fast. Boniface was haunted by failure. His dream of ruling over kings and bending nations to the will of the church was shattered. King Philip IV of France had outplayed him first with propaganda, then with violence. Night after night, the memory returned. Sciarra Colonna's slap, Nogaret's icy demands, the betrayal of allies, the silence of fleeing cardinals. His unfinished bull against Philip sat abandoned, its dried ink a symbol of defeat. The mighty Pope who once ruled with thunder was now a man deserted and alone. It was October 11, 1303, just weeks after the outrage at Anagni, Boniface's struggle came to an end. In his chamber, surrounded by candlelight and silence, he collapsed. Some said it was fever, others whispered it was a broken heart, but all agreed the shame at Anagni had killed him. The bells of St. Peter's tolled in mourning, their sound carrying across Rome. The Pope who dreamed of empire was gone. Yet in death, his enemies were not finished with him. In Paris, King Philip the Fair received the news with a cold smile. At only 35, his ambition burned stronger than ever. Boniface was dead, but Philip wanted more than victory. He wanted to destroy the Pope's very memory. Guillaume de Nogaret, ever relentless, launched a campaign of accusations, heresy, blasphemy, simony, even murder. Pamphlets spread across France, preachers filled pulpits with venom, and Philip demanded a posthumous trial. To kill Boniface's body was not enough. Philip sought to kill his name forever. Could the Pope's legacy survive such merciless hatred? The papacy staggered in the wake of Boniface's death. The throne of St. Peter, once unshakable, now wobbled. Cardinals quarreled, factions formed, and the authority of Rome cracked. The reforming vision of a universal church, ruling both souls and kingdoms, collapsed with Boniface. Even more shocking was the silence. Europe did not rise in outrage over Anagni. Instead, kings grew bolder. They commanded armies, hoarded gold, and stirred loyalty through national pride. Where once men trembled at excommunication, they now rallied to their monarchs. The crown was beginning to eclipse the tiara. As 1303 drew to a close, the war between church and state stood at a crossroads. Boniface's fall was not only the death of a man, but the death of an era. His dream of papal supremacy had crumbled under the weight of secular ambition. In Paris, Philip plotted his future, a future where kings bowed only to God. In Rome, the papacy mourned, fractured and fading. The legacy of Boniface VIII, his bulls, his defiance, his dream of empire hung in the balance. And the medieval world, once illuminated by the church's light, now flickered with the fire of crowns. The battle for Christendom's soul was far from over. In late 1303, Rome mourned the death of Pope Boniface VIII. The once mighty pontiff, brought low by humiliation, was now only a memory. The Vatican stood in shadows, its marble halls echoing with doubt. Into this uneasy silence stepped Pope Benedict XI, a gentleman chosen to heal the broken church. Seeking peace, he absolved King Philip IV of guilt in the Anagni outrage. Only Guillaume de Nogaret and Sciarra Colonna, the men who carried out the attack, were excommunicated. But Benedict's reign was brief. Within 8 months, he was dead, worn down by the weight of his office. The throne of St. Peter was empty once again. What kind of pope would follow in Boniface's shadow? The conclave dragged on for a year, torn between factions. Finally, in 1305, compromise emerged. Bertrand de Got, a Frenchman tied to Philip's court, was crowned Pope Clement V. Unlike Boniface, he was no fighter. Instead, he was pliable, cautious a man Philip could bend. In Paris, the French king, now 37, smiled with satisfaction. He had outlasted Boniface, and now, with Clement, he saw a chance to control the church itself. Would the papacy now dance to the tune of a king? In 1309, Clement made a choice that stunned Christendom. He abandoned Rome and moved the papal court to Avignon, a small town on the Rhone River under French sway. The Vatican, once the eternal heart of the church, was left behind, its basilicas gathering dust. Avignon, with its modest palaces, became the new seat of papal power. To many, this was betrayal, a Babylonian captivity, with the papacy seen as a prisoner of France. Could the church survive when its shepherd lived under a king's shadow? Clement's reign was filled with concessions to Philip. He erased Boniface's bold bulls Clarissis Laikos, Ausculta Fili, Unam Sanctum, the very documents that once defied the French crown. In 1310, he agreed to a tribunal to examine the charges against Boniface's memory: heresy, blasphemy, simony, even murder. The hearings dragged on for years, never reaching a verdict, but Philip had already won. Even the trial itself kept Boniface's name tainted, his legacy chained to scandal. And Clement's submission went further still. At Philip's command, he moved to crush the Knights Templar. Once a proud order of warriors and bankers, the Templars were destroyed by fire and accusation, their wealth seized by the crown. Clement, bound by loyalty to France, gave his blessing. Across Europe, the shift to Avignon sent shockwaves. In England, the Empire, and beyond, rulers and scholars denounced the papacy as a puppet of France. Songs and pamphlets mocked the Avignon popes. Their authority weakened, their independence gone. The once universal church was now tangled in national politics, its moral power dim. The crown of France was shining brighter than the tiara of Rome. The Avignon Papacy had begun a 68-year exile that would change the medieval world. Philip, the king who dared to strike a pope, had reshaped Christendom. His vision of a France free from Rome's decrees had triumphed. In Avignon, Pope Clement V ruled in luxury, but his heart carried the weight of compromise. And the legacy of Boniface VIII, his defiance, his dream of supremacy faded into memory. A new chapter had opened, a church in chains, a king ascendant, and a Europe set on a path toward an uncertain future. It was 1377, and the winds of change swept across a fractured Christendom. In Rome, the Eternal City stirred from a long exile as Pope Gregory XI stepped once more onto its ancient soil, the first pontiff to live in the Vatican in nearly 70 years. The Avignon Papacy, that gilded exile mocked as the Babylonian captivity, had ended. Its French palaces were left behind, traded for the crumbling grandeur of St. Peter's. The return brought hope, a chance to restore the papacy's universal claim. Yet the shadow of 1303 Anagni, Boniface VIII's humiliation, King Philip IV's triumph still hung heavy, a wound that had reshaped the world. The bells of Rome rang out, but their song was bittersweet. The church's glory was tarnished, its authority flickering like a candle in the storm of rising crowns. Could the papacy ever reclaim the power it had lost? The seeds of this moment had been planted decades earlier at Anagni. Guillaume de Nogaret and Sciarra Colonna had stormed Boniface's palace, laying violent hands on the Vicar of Christ. That Anagni slap was more than an insult, it was a crack in the foundation of the medieval papacy, the moment when secular power dared to strike the divine. Boniface's death, later in 1303, broken by betrayal and humiliation, marked the beginning of decline. Under French popes like Clement V, the tiara bowed to the crown. The Avignon years, 1377, glimmered with wealth and ceremony. But to much of Christendom in England, in the Empire, in the far corners of Europe, it looked like betrayal. The papacy was no longer universal. It was stolen, reduced to a French puppet. Would the return to Rome be enough to undo 70 years of captivity? The answer came swiftly. In 1378, only a year after Gregory XI's return, the Western Schism tore the church apart. Rival popes emerged, one in Rome, another in Avignon, each backed by kings and princes who used religion as a weapon. The faithful, once united beneath a single pontiff, were forced to choose sides. Monarchs, emboldened by Philip's example, seized the moment, shaping churches within their own borders. The papacy, once Europe's supreme judge, had become a pawn in the chessboard of crowns. The schism dragged on until 1417, a scar on Christendom, born from the outrage of Anagni and its revelation that popes could be humbled by kings. Could the papacy survive when even unity was shattered? Beneath the grandeur of St. Peter's, in the Vatican grottos, Boniface VIII's bones still lay preserved. Philip IV had long sought to stain his memory, calling him heretic, blasphemer, simoniac, even murderer. Trials were staged, accusations hurled, but the bones endured. They remained a silent defiance, a reminder of a man who dreamed of a church higher than kings, even as that dream lay broken. The Anagni outrage, the Avignon exile, the Western schism, together they marked a turning point. The temporal power of the papacy, once towering, had crumbled. Kings like Philip had proven they could rule their churches, laying foundations for the modern nation-state. Authority flowed less from Rome and more from national thrones. The age of monarchs had begun. Yet the echoes of 1303 reached even further. The humiliation of the papacy, its exile in Avignon, and the chaos of the schism sparked whispers of reform. In monasteries and universities, voices questioned the church's wealth, its morals, its very authority. These murmurs grew louder, and by the 16th century they would erupt into the Protestant Reformation, forever splintering Christendom. The clash between Boniface and Philip the Tiara and the Crown was no passing feud. It was the spark that lit the long fuse of change. As the 14th century waned, Rome stood reborn yet scarred. The papacy, back from its Babylonian exile, struggled to reclaim its glory. The faithful looked upon St. Peter's with hearts torn between hope and doubt. The legacy of the stolen papacy was written in stone. Boniface's defiance, Philip's triumph, the fall of papal supremacy. It was the story of a pope who dreamed of being emperor and a king who dared to bring him down. And it was the story of a world transformed, where crowns grew heavier than tiaras, and the dream of a united Christendom gave way to the dawn of a new age.